Hey there, Capstone. Welcome back. Today we are going to start talking about ideological identity. Hopefully you've done the reading already, so the next few words look familiar to you. So first things first, I want to differentiate between two components of ideology from the homework reading. The first is what we call an operational ideology. This is how you feel about the role of government given your specific issue positions. So if I were to ask you, how do you think we should handle healthcare, or how you feel about taxes, or how you feel about raising or lowering the minimum wage, I could take those positions of yours and deduce what you think the role of government should be in everyday life. Should it be more active? Should it be less active? This is a belief system, not an identity in and of itself. This is what we typically talk about when we talk about ideology, your belief system about the role of government. So because this is not an identity in and of itself, that means it's really different from partisanship. Partisanship is an identity flat out. So those two things differ quite a bit. However, there's this other facet of ideology that we're going to focus most of our time on, and that is symbolic ideology. And as opposed to operational ideology, which is about your philosophy about the role of government, symbolic ideology is the identification piece. So it's how you label yourself. Do you call yourself a liberal? Do you call yourself a conservative, a moderate, a libertarian? This is a label. So this is an identity in and of itself. So in certain ways, symbolic ideology has similarities to partisanship because both of those are identities in and of themselves. The really interesting thing about these two components of ideology, and this is sort of a preview for what's about to come, is that they don't always match up. So for example, 30%, at least as of a few years ago, 30% of the American population was consistently liberal in their operational ideology. They wanted more government activity, especially in the economy, but they label themselves as conservatives. That's very strange. So these two things don't always match. Sometimes they do. Some people who are actually liberal or who are actually conservative label themselves appropriately, but sometimes they don't. So that should sort of send out warning signals to you that something very strange is going on with ideological identification in the symbolic sense. So here's what it would look like if I was trying to measure your symbolic ideology, by the way. Here's a 7-point scale going from extremely liberal to extremely conservative. I would ask you where you place yourself on this scale. Now, I should note here that in political science, we very much know that ideology is not a unidimensional scale. It's much more than liberal to conservative. But for the sake of the example, we're just going to use this scale. You'll notice that you could do the same scale with partisanship. You just change the labels. Suddenly you're talking about a strong Democrat to a strong Republican. So in that sense, symbolic ideology and partisan self-placement, we measure them very similarly. We just ask, how do you put this label on yourself? So as with partisanship, we are going to ask, where does ideology come from in terms of the identity component? Now, there are many theories as to where your ideological orientations come from. We're not going to go through all of them. There are people who say this has to do with your moral values. There are people who say this has to do with your personality structure. There are people who say this has to do with your cognitive preferences. That basically means, do you like to categorize things? Do you like it when there's ambiguity in information, or would you rather have something be close-ended? Those are really interesting studies, but they do not distinguish between the philosophical ideology, that operational ideology, and the symbolic identification ideology. They talk about them as though they're one and the same, and they're not. However, there are some studies that try to tease these things apart. So the first theory I'm about to tell you about looks very familiar to you. Here we go. That slide you should recognize from a previous video. If you think back, we talked about a theory of partisanship and why people identify the way that they do, and it has to do with the social groups that are associated with those parties. We actually think this is the same thing that goes on for ideological identification. Just change the word Democrat and Republican to liberal and conservative, and it's pretty much the same thing. This has been tested empirically as early as 1980. Stanley Feldman and Pam Conover used national election study data, and all of the group labels that you see here, these are questions that were asked in this survey. Basically, on a 100-point scale, how do you rate Protestants? How do you rate working men? How do you rate whites? How do you rate middle-class people? All of these different social groups that sort of fall under different categorizations. And what they found was that people's sort of positive or negative feelings towards those groups were, once again, better predictors of which ideological label they chose for themselves than their issue positions and then their feelings about the role of government. So there is something compelling about this idea of social groups and how we feel about them relating to what political identities we give ourselves. So once again, I'm going to say this because we say it a lot in political psych. We are social animals first, not political animals. We understand people and groups of people better than we understand vague abstractions such as the role of government in society. However, there's a lot more. There are other indicators that ideology as an identity has a social component to it. So I want to walk through some of those. So here's indicator 1, ideological sophistication. There are a number of people out there in the public who do not understand what ideological labels like liberal and conservative actually mean, yet they use a label to describe themselves. So I've put on this slide some questions that I've personally used in my research to try to understand who gets ideological labels and who doesn't. So we'll ask questions like this, the second one. Generally speaking, is raising taxes on big businesses more economically liberal or more economically conservative? There are objectively correct and incorrect answers to these questions. So just using 3 or 4 questions, we can sort of figure out who understands what liberalism means and who understands what conservatism means. And lo and behold, a chunk of people do not understand what these words actually symbolize, yet they call themselves a liberal or a conservative. So there's some sort of groupy thing going on here that doesn't really have anything to do with the role of government or with your issue positions. So that's indicator 1, just this ideological disconnect with people who understand what the words mean, people who don't. Number 2, this is a really clever study by Lelkes and Malka. So they wanted to understand if ideological labels act as basically informational cues and social cues. So what they've done here is they've come up with a policy that people typically don't think a lot about or understand: farm subsidies, which is strange because I actually showed you a video on that talked about farm subsidies last week. So just pretend that that didn't happen. But basically, when they show people this policy without any ideological labels next to it, people are all over the place. They don't know how to feel about this policy because they don't understand it and they haven't thought a lot about it. But if they show liberals this policy and they tell them that liberals really oppose this policy, suddenly people are following that group cue. And the same thing is happening for conservatives. When we say that, conservatives oppose this policy, suddenly the people who are conservative will start to oppose it too. So people are following their group cues. The image that you see on the screen here is an interaction effect. So there is something more to ideology than just the role of government. It looks like there's some groupiness component in there as well. So that's indicator 2. Indicator 3, I love this study. It's actually, I think it's unpublished still, which is a shame. But indicator 3 is by Huddy and Young. This was a phone survey that was conducted in New York State, and it's an open-ended question survey. So what they do is they ask people, when you think of, I messed up the slide here. When you hear the words liberal and conservatives, what do you think of first? And they're allowed to write anything that they want. They can write a sentence, they can write a 5-paragraph essay. But what they do is they go through everyone's responses and they try to pull out some of the key themes in the responses and categorize those themes to figure out how people are conceptualizing these words. And what's interesting here is there tend to be a decent number of people that do talk about belief systems when they hear liberals and conservatives, but you'll notice that there's also a lot of talk about character and personality traits, which is odd because liberalism and conservatism really don't have to do with personality traits. They have to do with the role of government in our lives and issue positions. They recognize that using the words liberals and conservatives might nudge people towards talking about people. So down here I have this thing in red that says, this also happened when they changed the phrasing of the question to say, what's the first thing that you think about when you hear the word liberalism or conservatism? And the same thing happens. There are a lot of people who are talking about personality traits when they're prompted to speak about liberalism or conservatism. Personality traits really have nothing to do with that. Let's take a look at some of those personality traits that they listed. So I've got this in 4 groupings here. These are words that come directly from the paper. There are positive traits that people assign to liberals, like open-minded and free-thinking and easygoing. And there are negative traits. They're inflammatory, they're radical, they're naive and irrational. There are positive traits for conservatives. They're moral, they have backbone, they're self-reliant, they're disciplined. There's also negative traits for conservatives. They're closed-minded, they're rigid, they're stuck in the past, they're backwards. So these come up a lot in people's open-ended responses. And I'm not going to go through this whole chart with you guys because I know that can get a little bit dry, but this is a regression table and it's trying to show what predicts how people in this survey label themselves. So why are some people calling themselves liberal, which is a 1, versus a conservative, which is a 5? And in brackets down here in red, this is the area where people are talking about personality traits. And you'll see that when that's put into model 3, stars are coming up for all of these different personality traits. And what that's showing is people that have positive associations with liberals in terms of personalities and traits, they're more likely to call themselves liberals. People that have positive affiliations with conservatives in terms of personality traits, they're more likely to call themselves conservatives. And these are unique predictors of how people are labeling themselves above and beyond their ideas about the role of government, their gender, their age, their education, all of those basic controls that we usually put in. So this is pretty interesting. People just sort of automatically start thinking about character traits when they're prompted to talk about ideology. So what is the common denominator from all of these studies? Well, the common denominator is that when people think about ideology, they are often thinking about people and groups and identities. They are not just thinking about issues and the role of government. In some cases, they are thinking more about people and groups than issues and the role of government. There is some social and identity style component affixed to ideological labels. So this is where some political psychologists get pretty serious about this whole all politics is identity politics thing. And some of you guys may not agree with the phrase that I have written on the slide here. It says, do you have your ideology because you genuinely believe this philosophy is the ideal way to run society for everyone? Or do you have this ideology because it will benefit you and people like you, which is a much more identity-based understanding of ideology? Some of you might be thinking, screw you, Amira, I have an ideology and it's genuine and it's coming from the right place. And that might be true, right? There are people out there that genuinely are principled conservatives and genuinely are principled libertarians and liberals who really believe in the role of government. But there is a fairly widely shared theory that much of this does come from a place of identity that has to do with identities that you like. And so that is a discussion that we can absolutely have on the discussion boards because it's an interesting one. So again, maybe your face looks like this right now, right? This realization that even though there are people that do care about issues there and people that might genuinely have a philosophy about the role of government, there is a lot going on in politics that is identity related, even when we talk about these big political concepts that are supposed to be related to abstract notions of government involvement in our lives. So another question that I want to leave you guys with is this. These slides talked about a social and identity component to ideology, but we didn't actually talk about social identity theory, right? These slides were not about whether or not you hear liberals insulted, you feel personally insulted. We didn't get to that. This is actually still kind of an open field. So that's something that we can talk about on the discussion boards, and I'll see you guys next time.